This panel really builds on everything we've had at the conference so far and is designed to really talk fairly directly and explicitly to why we would have a Rural Futures Institute and what its advantages and what its aspirations and limitations might be. We have a distinguished panel, which I would introduce now. On my far left is Timothy Eatman. He's an assistant professor of higher education at Syracuse University, director of research for Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life. He's an educational sociologist who examines the pipeline to graduate school for students from groups that are traditionally underrepresented in higher education. He's part of an interdisciplinary team of researchers working on a National Science Foundation funded study about the uses of post-9/11 educational benefits for service persons who may aspire to degrees and careers in engineering. Next to Tim is Alice Diebel. She is a program officer with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation in Dayton, Ohio. Kettering's overarching research question is, what does it take for democracy to work as it should? In her research, she has studied experiences and perspectives public administrators have about key democratic practices, such as naming and framing issues in public terms, making decisions through public deliberation, and implementing decisions through public acting. To her right, I'm not going to introduce him again. I don't want it to go to his head. It's been introduced enough already. And I could say the person to my immediate left needs no introduction, but it is Tom Osborne, the 13th athletic director at the University of Nebraska, first coach in college football history to retire as a reigning national champion. But he's here because over a significant congressional career, he's thought deeply about rural Nebraska and how one might make it better. So I'm going to first ask Ronnie if he would frame the issues he'd like us to talk about, which of course won't limit us in any way.
I'm very accustomed to that from my boss. Is this pretty loud? Okay. Well, I just want to, I guess, frame our discussion a little bit here. The charge I have to start us off is to talk a little bit about why we've come up with this concept for a Rural Futures Institute and a little bit of the history involved in that from the university perspective. And I guess I want to start before doing the historical part with a little bit of a story to frame it personally for me. Many of you in the room will know, the Nebraskans at least in the room will know, that I'm a pretty new person at the university. I came here a little less than 2 years ago into this role. I think I've got the best job in the whole university system because I get to work with agriculture and I get to work in this environment in such an important issue that the rural part of our state and region faces. I also, though, grew up in a rural place. I grew up in a rural environment in Virginia. Was able to go get my education in the land-grant system, as many of you know. And I married a rural person from Nebraska who told me as we were leaving Nebraska in 1989, going to my first job out of graduate school, that her motive in life was to get me back in Nebraska. So a little under 10 years ago, we had the opportunity to come back and move to rural Nebraska in a really unusual circumstance where I was leading a national research program for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, 40% of which was the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center at Clay Center, Nebraska, about an hour west of here, which happened to be my wife's home county, where she grew up across the highway, literally, from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. So we've spent the last 9 years of our life in Sutton, Nebraska, in a small town, rural town of 1,400 people, now about 75 miles west of Lincoln. And we're leaving Sutton, Nebraska this summer to come to Lincoln when our third child graduates this weekend from Sutton High School. So we've seen 3 children go through a rural upbringing and environment. So when I got to the university and I was looking at this position, one of the things that I was challenged by the administration of the university system, by J.B. Milliken, who's joined us here after getting off a plane from India. I don't know how you do it, J.B. But I was challenged by J.B. and by Linda Pratt to say, if you were to come into this position, what would you do with the rural part of your position? And what would you do with the opportunity that we have to maybe build upon what was then known, what we've had as a rural initiative here at the University of Nebraska? And I couldn't have been more pleased by that. In fact, it was one of the things that attracted me to this role, was to have the opportunity to come at a time when the planets were aligning, so to speak, around these issues. So a little bit of history. In the late 1990s, our state legislature in Nebraska had quite a bit of discussion about what could the university do to address the rural, and I think some of the language was used, drain of people from rural Nebraska to turn that around? Was there a way that we could engage in a different way than we had been historically to address that? And over the course of a couple of years, the legislature talked about that in several different ways. The result of that was that the Board of Regents of the university system here in 2002 put forward the proposal that we would put some funding into a new program that has been known as the Rural Initiative, the University of Nebraska Rural Initiative. Many of the people that are on this planning team for this conference actually have been part of that Rural Initiative program over the last 8 or 9 years. When I came to the university and looked at this position, there had been a review of that rural initiative that had been done by an external team. I think Sam Cordes, who is part of our organizers here, was part of that external review team that came here in 2008 to take a look at the 5-year progress of the rural initiative. And the key thing that they said there was that the rural initiative was the right idea to be a catalyst to help rural communities see the future and grow the future, but that it wasn't enough, that it was too small, that it was almost a shot in the dark, if you will, at a big, huge set of issues that we needed to think about whether we were willing to engage at a much higher level. So what I was challenged to do was go back and take a look at that and study that history, study the rural initiative, and say, what should we do next? Should we engage in a different way? Should we think about it in a different way? And what grew out of that conversation over the following few months was the genesis of this idea of maybe the university system across all of the campuses of the university could engage with stakeholders, could engage with partners to go to that much higher level, to think about the rural futures of fill in the blank, Nebraska, regional, global. We don't have that scoped out quite yet. So the conversation we've been having here the last few days is the result of that process and the result of thinking about, we do believe that we should engage at a much higher level. We do know that's going to take maybe a different model than what we've had before. We do know that there are lots of questions to be answered about how you do that and how you engage at that level. Over the last year, we've had a number of conversations, and you'll see that in the forward of your proceedings or your, guidebook of the conference, that talks about the fact that we have engaged the campuses of the university system, whether that be the Med Center in Omaha or the University of Nebraska at Omaha or University of Nebraska at Kearney, University of Nebraska at Lincoln here, our technical ag program at Curtis, all of those campuses about this concept. What is your interest in this? Would you like to be engaged in this? What are the questions we're going to have to answer in order to make it work? We also have engaged people out in the state. We started with a group of the state legislators last summer where we engaged in a discussion with them about this. We then followed that in discussions in communities across the state culminating, I think, Kayla and Kim really here just in the last month, where we finished the last one of those that was in Valentine's. So you'll see that list of communities that we had these focus groups in around the state. I think just under 600 total people that we engaged over the course of that year with this idea. Bringing you to this conference, getting you in this room, listening to you tomorrow particularly, is a seminal part of this development. Because as you've seen today, we don't have the answers to all of the questions yet. What we want to do is design this right. I've used the term that several of you have heard before, and I hope none of you find this offensive, but I'll just be realistic about it. I don't want this opportunity, this time that we have ahead of us, to get lost on the roadkill of good ideas, the roadkill of rural development, because I think there is a lot. I think all of you in the room can think about the fact that there is a lot of roadkill in that arena. We want to do this to be productive and make it right and make it meaningful for our state, our region, and beyond, perhaps. So that's what I would say to start. That's a little bit of the history. We have appreciated your discussion so much, and I'm going to encourage you tomorrow. I'm going to be bopping around the rooms, really listening to you engage in that dialogue. But that's a little bit of background to open our conversation, Harvey.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie. So that's the challenge, and I guess I would invite our panelists to each take a few minutes and respond to it, or just your general thoughts about what you've seen and how you could help us formulate the Institute and its agenda. So Tim, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I'm delighted to be here. Was really excited to have the opportunity to connect and to think together with the Planning Committee about this idea of Rural Futures Institute. I represent Syracuse University's faculty in higher education, but also 90-plus member university consortium called Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life. And so the idea of imagining forward, this Futures Institute, is something that resonates with me. I feel compelled to pull out some of my cornfield creds, if that's okay. I haven't shoveled any pig dung or anything like that, but I did. So I spent a decade in Champaign-Urbana doing doctoral work at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And you can imagine that for a brother from Harlem, New York, going to Champaign-Urbana, it was quite a cultural shift, yes? I was trying to figure out what those things next to the cornfields were, and someone told me they were parking meters, and that was very difficult for me to actually figure out what that was about. But I came to really love and enjoy my experience in the Midwest. I know there are different definitions of rural, and some might not consider Champaign-Urbana to be rural. But I can tell you that many of the locales that I visited with my wife, who's a speech pathologist, out in Hoopeston, Illinois, to work with migrant workers, those are certainly rural places. We started our family there in Champaign-Urbana and had a wonderful community. And my goal was to get back east, actually, because that's my home. And I love my home and think of it as a place where a quality life is. And so one of the things that I wanted to evoke in this conversation, having heard some of the conversations that have gone forward, is to be sure that as we develop the idea of the importance of this institute, that we not essentialize a certain way of life, a certain kind of culture. We can be more sophisticated than that. And I've heard a good balance of that treated in these dialogues already, but I think it's very important for us to understand. In academia, we have a penchant for, as Scott Peters calls it, a heroic meta-narrative, right? Where, everything sort of, ascends to work out just fine. And that's not real life. That's not how institutions develop, it's not how people develop, it's not how lives develop. And so I'm excited to be a part of the conversation, to introduce perhaps some of those things and build on some of the things we've heard already that help us to push back against that heroic meta-narrative, not necessarily to a tragic counter-narrative, as Scott also talks about, but really to more of a prophetic narrative that helps us think forward to the future. And I'm very excited about that. I think one of the essential dimensions of that is being sure that we do not sideline this issue of interdisciplinarity. It has been a refrain the last day that we've been here. But my interest in the humanities, arts, and design, and the cultural disciplines, and understanding how they factor into the landscape of higher education is something that makes me really sensitive to those conversations. And so the keynote last night with Mr. Sartori and the youth panel last night was very refreshed to hear those themes evoked. One of the things that I would say as I wind down my comments is that I want to be sure that in addition to the 1862 Moral Act, we would be clear and remember the 1890 Moral Land Grant Act, which had a very significant impact on American higher education. I don't have to tell you what that is. Clearly, you know it had to do with segregation and establishing a different set of institutions, and we wrestle with that today. There's no reason that the room looks the way that it does. We know that in 1910, 3 out of 4 African Americans lived on farms. And so I think that in order for us to have a healthy conversation about the future, we need to understand the past and appreciate it, and to be sure that we attend to those dimensions, not to disparage or to paralyze, but to make us all a bit more humble. As a sociologist, I'm sensitive to the issues of how we have structured our societies, and think it's very important for us to be very clear that we have the structures that we have for a certain reason. So I'll have some other comments, but I thought maybe I'd begin that way.
Thank you, Tim. Alex?
Well, I think one of my jobs is to talk more about people. And I think we've heard some very excellent presentations, very exciting stuff about entrepreneurs doing really good things and all that. But all this is going on in the context of a rural future and a Rural Futures Institute. And when I think about rural, I think about communities and communities of people and people that have habits of interacting. They have fights with each other. They don't know how to get along sometimes. Politics, even in small places, can be somewhat divided. So from a perspective of someone who cares about democracy and how that works, I think about what is the commitment of a Rural Futures Institute to help communities strengthen their ability to solve their own problems. And that means that there's a need to rely on the assets, we heard about assets earlier, the assets that are in those communities, and helping people recognize that it's not just the one bright kid with a good idea that's an asset, but everybody is an asset. I think in most communities, people want a few simple things. This is urban or rural. They want a place to educate their kids. They want to have a safe place to be. They want health, a place to have healthy futures and to promote values, and they want to prosper. So what is it then that a university could do about those sorts of issues that will help citizens gain control over their own futures? I've heard people talk about things that seem outside people's control. Big agriculture has come in, this was in one of the forewords. And the population is moving out. So what would it take for a university to help citizens wrestle with how do we deal with these changes in our community and how we build the kind of community that we want? You have one very, very rich resource in the land grant system that I've only heard mentioned a couple of times, and once was from the audience, and that's the Cooperative Extension Department. You have people in every single county that are building these kinds of relationships in communities. what kind of capacity do they need then to help citizens work out their problems, to help citizens connect then with university resources in important ways? How is it that they can start to say, maybe I don't want this big ag this time. It was helpful before, but now maybe I'm looking for some kind of exotic plant that I could sell somewhere else, or some sort of rural development kind of program. I guess I would just want to say that if you're taking seriously having communities be parts of these conversations, that Bailey's vision, Liberty Hyde Bailey's vision, really does come alive when he talks about the welfare of a community depends on the public spirit of the people and the character of the people. So how do you build the character of the people? Is that your job? I think it is. And you can do that in part by creating space for people to come together to talk across their differences. If you think there aren't disagreements because the town is small and everybody looks alike, that wouldn't be true. I think anybody who lives in a small town out there would probably nod their heads. So how do you get people to come across their differences to solve problems together, instead of having one person solve all the problems in the town and everybody else sits on the sidelines? Or that the university comes in, we have the best program for you, we can tell you how to do it, and why doesn't that work all the time? So I think it's engaging the citizens in solving their own problems and helping people shape their own futures.
Okay, Tom?
Well, you're probably all wondering, what's this old guy doing up here? Probably ought to be talking about the short side option or something like that. But spent a little time in Congress, and during that period of time was struck by the fact that in rural Nebraska, most of the counties had about 1/3 to 1/2 the population that they had during the 1930s. And most of the young people were leaving. Many towns were drying up. And it's probably already been discussed sometime today, the genesis. Remember the Homestead Act back in 1862 provided a quarter section of land. And most of those quarters had a family. That family was usually anywhere from 4 to maybe 8 or 9 people, pretty large families in those days. So the average section of land probably had 20, 25 people on it. Today it's roughly 2 to 3 because farms are much larger. In 1940, I think the farmer fed 19 people. Today they feed 155. So there's been a tremendous surge of mechanization, and as everybody knows, farms have gotten bigger. Back in those days, towns were 7, 8 miles apart. That's how long it took to drive in a horse and buggy into town, shop for 2 or 3 hours, and then drive back. And so you don't need towns 7, 8 miles apart anymore. But still they're there, and how do you preserve them? What do you do? And so one thing that we hit upon was entrepreneurship. We published an entrepreneurship handbook, and we began to engage people throughout the 3rd District in terms of what that might do. Because if you went to a high school and there were, let's say, 20, 30 graduates, probably not more than 1 or 2 were planning on sticking around because there was nothing for them to do. Unless their family had a large operation and they could somehow find space on the land, they're going to move away. And so the idea was, if you could teach people how to write a business plan, how to secure capital, how to turn an idea into something that was profitable, you'd have some beginning businesses that would start to spring up. Some of those would hire 1 or 2 people. Some would hire 10 or 15. Once in a while you'd have some place like the Buckle in Kearney with hundreds or thousands, Cabela's, Profit Systems in Ogallala, high-tech places that maybe hire 200, 300 people. But unless you can teach people how to do that, you're not going to really enable rural Nebraska to be as it once was. We have tremendous resources in Nebraska. I am very, very confident of the future. The greatest resource we have is the Ogallala Aquifer. There's only so much fresh water in the world. There are about 6, 7 states that have parts of the Ogallala Aquifer. We have 80% of the water. And as time goes on, that will be more valuable than minerals, be more valuable than oil. And so we're truly blessed. We have a unique landscape where we have livestock. We also have the ability to grow excellent crops of grain. And of course, they support each other because you feed grain to livestock. And as a result, there's great opportunities from the ag sector. But we've got to figure more spin-offs, more ways to leverage the agricultural sector. And I've got some ideas which I'll share later, some things that I saw work, because the university as a land grant institution absolutely has to be engaged in this issue. And so I was very pleased and impressed when I heard Ronnie first start talking about this issue, and very glad to hear the Chancellor and JB also be on board. In Congress every year I would have the university come in with about 30 different requests, and only 4 or 5 of them usually had to do with agriculture, and those are the ones that I usually focused on. One last comment. At one time I think Nebraska had 7 congressional districts. Now we're down to 3, which you probably say is a very good thing. And we may be headed toward 2. And because we're growing, but we're growing at a much slower pace. And the main reason is depopulation of rural America, depopulation of Nebraska. So I think one of the main objectives of this conference should be to figure out how you turn that around, because we've got some great people out there, and we're losing our best and our brightest annually. And that's the one resource we can't afford to lose. So enough from me, Harvey, and
Okay,
go from there.
thanks. I'm going to ask the panel a couple of questions, and they really are set up for inviting the audience to participate as well. Okay, we have this now. We can prove it because we have a logo.
A fine logo, too.
Right? What would be the 1 or 2 highest priority things that the Institute should do as it starts its first year, from your perspective? Alice, you want to go first?
I really value the Institute's transdisciplinary focus and this notion of working across disciplines. And you know, we had examples of that where we had a biologist and a chemist working together. But I think there might be other disciplines that would benefit close attention. Tim can probably speak to this a little bit better than I could, but you know, there are arts and there's social sciences and there are health disciplines, and there are lots of people out there that might have resources that could be brought to bear in terms of what a rural future might look like in a given community. It's not, in my mind, just entrepreneurship, but in also how communities can be stronger. So there might even be community resources brought to the table as part of that interdisciplinary sort of team.
Good. Tim?
Yeah, so at Syracuse University, our Chancellor, Nancy Cantor, has proffered a vision called Scholarship in Action. And some of you may know Syracuse is a Rust Belt city struggling with similar issues as we see in the rural communities, decline in population, exodus of businesses. One of the things that I have been doing in my role as Director of Research for Imagining America is to stimulate within our consortium a conversation about the reward system in academia. This question came up earlier, and I think it's one that we must pay attention to. And not only for tenure track faculty. I won't get diverted into a whole nother conversation about how important I think that is. The fact is, that only about, on average, 25% of the full-time instructors on campuses are tenure-track faculty. So we have to deal with that issue as well. But the reward system, I think, is very important. And so one of the highest goals or priorities in my mind is for some sophisticated thinking to be brought to bear around knowledge making in the 21st century. What does that mean? How does it manifest? We need to deal with policy issues that facilitate the rewarding of publicly engaged scholars of all kinds, tenure track, non-tenure track, contingent faculty, people who have one foot in the academy and one foot in the community, and we can do that. So my 15-year-old, she's 16 now, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, has a blog that she started about 8 months ago. It's called Mixed Girl Problems. It's on Tumblr. The byline is, "No, we are not other." And she has about 18,000 followers from 140 countries. It blows my mind. I only raise that issue because we are in a different kind of world now on a number of dimensions. And I think that we ought to be able to think about the artifacts of scholarship, not only manifesting in the monograph, which is so important. I am a scholar. I do not think we ought to do away with traditional ways of doing scholarly work. But in the 21st century, we need to think about counting the value of the legal brief, counting the value of the community revitalization plan, counting the value of web-based resources of all sorts. And I think that that ought to be a priority, having a conversation about changing the criteria for promotion and tenure in particular. It's one that we had at Syracuse. It's the reason I have this nervous twitch because as a new person to the academy, to the university, I was on the Academic Affairs Committee of the Senate that changed that language. And so there are a number of issues that relate to that, but building out this idea of publicly engaged scholarship and finding ways that we can have fair, F-A-I-R, criteria for engaged faculty, as opposed to fear, F-E-A-R. I don't really know how we're going to do this. Do I need to do both? Enough with that. We are in the 21st century. We can be more sophisticated, more expansive about this. And I am not saying we must do away with traditional scholarship. No, we have to have ways to be more sophisticated in this context. So that would be one of my first directions for it.
Tom, I suspect you would say entrepreneurship is a high priority. But you had an opportunity while you were in Congress to see the university from the outside, and you tried to engage with us on a number of ways to move your agenda forward. Do you have thoughts about what was good about the university's response, what was a barrier to the university's response that this institute ought to address?
Yeah, I think early on, at times I felt that the university was interested but a little bit disengaged from the rural Nebraska issues. As time went on, I felt more and more encouraged. I saw Prem Paul getting more interested in water issues and some of the issues with our rivers, the cooperative agreement, the Republican in Kansas issues, those things were important. And then just general initiatives in terms of how are you going to feed the rest of the world, because it looks like there's a growing crisis in terms of population. 6 billion people, going to be a lot more than that as time goes on. And there's only so much land, there's only so much water, so much food that we can produce. And so the ability to be more efficient, to use resources better, these are things I think the university absolutely has to be engaged in. And let me just mention one thing that I think will be of interest to all of you. talked to one guy this morning who I always thought was pretty innovative in a small town off the interstate. And if you're off the interstate and you're in a small town in Nebraska, it's pretty much a given that you're going to lose population and you're going to have a hard time. This particular community was maintaining population, but especially in 25 years of age and younger, it was increasing population. And so I said, well, what did you do? And I think this may not directly relate to the Institute, but I think anything we can do as a university to encourage these things would be very important. One thing that he mentioned may not be real popular. They had a 1% sales tax in this small community, and it was devoted entirely to economic development. So one thing they did was they hired a business coach, and this person specifically each year would work with 20, 25 businesses. And sometimes those businesses were not very adept in accounting, maybe not very good in marketing, not well schooled in IT, e-commerce. Those were things they didn't know anything about. And so they got the resources to those people. Made a big difference. Used tax increment financing. They built a new hospital. They added on to the school. They remodeled the downtown. And they changed the culture. They changed the mindset. Because you find in a lot of rural communities, people are sitting around sort of waiting for either somebody to give them a large donation from somewhere, or else they're waiting to die. And you don't see a mindset out there that we can do this. We can make it work. And I think one of the first things you have to do is change the mindset and change the leadership. And there are some towns that are doing really well and some that are 5 miles, 10 miles away that aren't doing well. And usually it just goes back to leadership. So whatever we can do in terms of training leaders, developing and promoting entrepreneurship. These folks teach entrepreneurship in the high school. They start even in the 7th and 8th grade. They teach kids how to do this. They're worried about business transfer. Somebody gets to be 65 years old, 60 years old. He may close up the hardware store and move to Florida. And so they're working 5, 10 years ahead of time to get an apprentice in there, somebody that can take it over. And so that's important. They realize that there's a generational wealth transfer that's going to occur. The average farmer, rancher is around 60 years old. And so all of that wealth has gone somewhere. And so they're getting a lot of that money into community foundations, where they're getting money for scholarships for economic development and putting money back into the community. So these things are very critical. And so it's not hopeless. It can be done, but you have to be very intelligent, very hardworking in terms of how you do these things. So just a few ideas I threw out, and I think that some of the initiatives that we're talking about here can be helpful to these communities in these regards. Gallup also is very interested in entrepreneurial activity. And so sometimes you can teach somebody how to write a business plan. You can teach them how to access capital. You can teach them how to turn an idea into a business. But that person may not know a whole lot about creating a good business culture. And so they're doing a lot of things with strengths assessment and working with the culture, the environment in a business to make it work. And these are things that a university can engage in as well. So just a few ideas that some of you might think about a little bit as time goes on.
You know, I wonder, it occurs to me that one of the risks associated with creating this institute is that communities in Nebraska will say, okay, the university is going to do this. How do we avoid that? Because I don't suspect we'll make much progress if it's just us. Is that a realistic concern?
I think absolutely. It's changing the mindset, as you know, we just heard. So the predominant metaphor for the academy is what?
Knowledge transfer.
Knowledge transfer is a really good one. It's not the one I was thinking of, but the predominant metaphor is the ivory
tower.
It's the ivory tower, right? It is a celebration of being removed from the community, a solipsistic sort of way of understanding your position in the academy. And people know that. And so we have to find ways to get out there to bring a rupture to that normative discourse, that normative paradigm. And I think we've heard some ideas about how that might be possible, but making that shift and being sure that employing publicly engaged scholarly approaches which foreground reciprocal knowledge making that is not, as Harry Boyd says, expert on top, but expert on tap, right? So that the flow is bidirectional, and communities can take that seriously when we address the posture, when there's democratic purpose in the way that we operate, when these are essential elements of engaged scholarship. So I think it's essential to deal with that mindset, and very possible.
And you've talked about culture change, and this is culture change not only in the communities, but also in the academy. I mean, imagine someone from a premier land grant institution going out to community and saying, I don't know what to do. I mean, you're approaching a community without an answer. And that's helpful in terms of building the capacity of the people that are there, right? They get to say, these are the things that I would like from you. Can you help me with this? Instead of you saying, here's what you need to solve your own problem. So it's sort of doing with instead of for. That's a culture change in the academy as well as in the community.
Well said.
But you're right, the community is used to you coming in and saying, we have some stuff for you. So it's good stuff, I know you want it.
We have something just quickly that's taking place in Syracuse right now. The main street, Syracuse is literally on a hill, right? So, I mean, you can look down into the city, literally. But the main street that is going to the campus is one way. And Chancellor Cantor is now making that bi-directional. So I took a picture the other day of, it's the University Avenue and the one-way sign, and I can't wait till it's down because I'm going to take a picture of that as well. But I think metaphorically, it's very powerful to understand us as being in a much richer place in terms of engaging communities.
Can I offer an example?
Please.
In the Rural Development Center in the South, the Southern Rural Development Center, a variety of communities decided they wanted to tackle poverty in the southern communities. And this is something the university doesn't really have any answers for, but it's certainly something that affects the quality of the communities that you want to thrive, that you want to survive and thrive. So they engaged in some dialogue in those communities trying to address problems of poverty. Now, they didn't come up with an answer. They came up with many answers. And when you talk about leadership development, they developed lots of leaders who did small things. May seem like small things, but they weren't things that were happening then. The people didn't think they could do these things. Things like, well, we're going to start a food pantry. We got broadband started now across this community. A whole variety of ideas that you can find on the SRDC website. So, you know, just by bringing people together that have never talked to each other before, even though it's a small rural community, African Americans and whites that got together in places that did not get together before, working on what they saw as a shared problem makes a difference. And this is the university's help without an answer.
Yeah, just one of the other things that has happened at Syracuse in the last 5 years is that a old furniture warehouse downtown was purchased and is part of the university and is actually now the home of many of the design departments. But a bus route was put in from Syracuse campus down to the warehouse. The warehouse has an art gallery and public spaces for gathering, and it's a place that people can come and convene, but it's called the Connective Corridor, this bus route. It's still underused. It's still a tremendous need to make sure that people understand that it is really a conduit to interface with the institution, but I think it's another example of the posturing that Alice made reference to. And I'll just say one other thing, because Alice and I are both involved with a federal level project called the American Commonwealth Partnership, which is a collective of many institutions of higher education that are thinking together about connecting with higher education associations and federal entities like the Department of Education, NEA, other federal and NSF, and institutions to really think about a new moral paradigm during this sesquicentennial. And we have had a launch on January 10 at the White House. It was tremendous. The Secretary of Education was there, and there are now these ongoing conversations about making the civic purposes of higher education endemic. And I think that sends a message also to communities that there's some serious interest in making a change.
Okay, what are the couple of things that we should avoid as we go forward? What are the biggest landmines you see for us?
Well, you mentioned one, going in with all the answers. Another one might be waiting for lots of money to do the work. A lot of the things that I described in these rural communities didn't take much money. They took the assets in the community for people, and the idea that people can do things. So what is it that the university can do to try to encourage citizens to see that they have some resources at play?
Yeah, just a couple of things. This is not so much what to avoid, but I think that the way you become successful is to build on your strengths, figure out what your assets are and then build on those. And one of the assets, I've already mentioned the aquifer and the land and all that type of thing, but probably the main asset in rural America, particularly rural Nebraska, is the people, because you have generally people with a very good work ethic. You have people who are basically pretty honest, and you have people that will cooperate. And so I was amazed at how many people would drive 30, 40 miles for a job that paid $10 an hour. I know that's not necessarily what you want to hear, that's not what you're looking for, but we see all of the export of jobs going to other parts of the world, India, sometimes to China, sometimes to South America. And recently, the same guy I talked to this morning said they'd gone down to Houston, and this guy was looking to get some help, and particularly labor. And he said, well, we can't go to either coast. He said, well, did you ever think about rural Nebraska? And so there's going to be a small manufacturing company that's going to move into this particular town because he understood what the workforce was like. Sometimes when you export jobs, you don't have high quality. Sometimes there's a language barrier. And we've found that whether it be a call center, whether it be a manufacturing business, whatever, people who start something in rural Nebraska are really pleased with the workforce. You cannot find people who will work that hard with that degree of integrity, and the price is usually pretty reasonable. So we think that's something that really needs to be looked at. One other thought was that when I was in the evil place back east,
The football program?
talking about Ohio State, of course.
Yeah.
But we would try to get interns from what is now the Rake School, and every summer, if we could get 5 or 6 of those interns out in the community, you'd be amazed at the difference they could make in 3 months in the summer, because they would invariably build a website for that community. They would work with businesses in terms of how they could use IT in their businesses. They would bring some ideas and some energy. And so one thing that we often propose to various communities, well, why don't you raise some money scholarship money and tell these kids, we'll send you to school for 4 years if you'll come back here and give us 3 years or 4 years. So if they come back, people who are gifted with a lot of energy, they're going to start something. And so we saw the power and the synergy that could be achieved through some really young, bright people, particularly those who were well-versed in IT affairs. And so that's something that the university can be all about, is encouraging some of our best and brightest, maybe not to spend their whole life, but to spend a summer, have an internship, learn something about rural America, because those are the people that will really make the innovative changes.
Harvey, I just feel kind of compelled to make this kind of a general statement here. One of the things that has been behind our thinking in this idea all along is the fact that we do have tremendous resources at the University of Nebraska. You know, one of the things that kind of surprised me when I came back to the university was to hear people talk about what we don't have. You know, I heard people say we don't have these resources, or we wish we had these resources, or we wish we had more. We have tremendous resources in the University of Nebraska. We have tremendous people. We have multiple campuses. We have tremendous expertise. So to build on what Tom Osborne was just saying, and what we've heard today several times in the conversations, to build on the strengths that we have, to me it's a focus issue. If we're going to focus on this set of issues, we may need to think about the way we reward scholarship, what our system is if we're going to do engagement in this way. We may need to rethink that, and we've heard that a lot today. But we have tremendous resources sitting in this room. We've heard about extension today several times. We have a tremendous extension program in this state. But I would also wager to you that extension may not be fully connected to the resources of the University of Nebraska Medical Center, or to the University of Nebraska Kearney, or to the University of Nebraska Omaha. You begin to get my picture here? And so to me, some of what we're talking about here is how do we connect the dots of what we have? And we focus those on these issues in ways that we've never done before. That's part of the discussion, I think, that we can have, because we do have tremendous resources, and we recognize, I think, I've said this a lot out in the state, I believe it. I wouldn't be saying it if I didn't believe it. I think we're at a time when the planets are aligning here in ways that are really unusual and phenomenal. Part of it is the resource base that this region has, this state has. Part of it is this need to feed 2 billion more people 40 years from now. Part of it is the fact we sit in the epicenter, one of the epicenters of the world, to do that. But we have to figure out how to make this landscape sustainable and healthy long-term to make that work, which includes what is our rural community fabric going to look like for that to be successful, in addition to feeding the world, in addition to that mission that we have in the world that's changing so rapidly. So to me, it's some of what we have to do in response to your question, Harvey, that, I don't know, maybe that, what was it that Fran said this morning, the smallest executable step? I think this conference is a huge smallest executable step in this discussion. I hope many of you feel that way, because I certainly do. But the smallest executable step will be for us to start figuring out how to connect those dots, how to connect those resources in ways that we begin to engage. If that makes sense, with the tremendous base that we have.
I'll just say quickly that the landmines, I think, really kind of are themed around the fact that we just need to be honest and introspective and understand that the context that we are in, academe, is really antithetical to community engaged work. That's what it is. And we have to rehearse that. All of us have to drag our attention back to that fact over and over again, because it is not the normative way that we work. We will sideline humanities, arts, and design because that's the default. We're in a neoliberal context where economic outcomes check the accounting, it means everything. And if we don't understand the larger purposes of knowledge making and bring that constantly to the conversation, we're in trouble. We have to be honest about the fact that there are the economic dimensions that we mentioned today, and there's some other ones, not so pretty, right? What do I mean? 20% of the United States population lives in rural communities. 60% of new prison construction is going on in rural communities. Should a Rural Futures Institute, I don't mean to be I may not get invited back, but should a Rural Institute be thinking about those issues? Should it have something to say about it? These are questions that the leadership has to pursue. And I think that honesty and authenticity registers very powerfully in that regard.
We have a few minutes. If there would be people in the audience that would like to contribute to this conversation. I think there's somebody heading to the microphone over here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Barry Dunn. From South Dakota State. I'm not a Nebraska farm boy, but I wish I was. Is that? I have a couple questions. In your formation of the Institute, how do you see the role of your land-grant neighbors in the Great Plains playing a role in it? And I'd like to expand the discussion to include the 1994s, 3 of which are within our borders, and it's the fastest, and the Native American population is the fastest growing population in South Dakota. So I guess I'd like a response to those things.
Well, leave it to my friend Barry Dunn to raise a good question like that. But I think we're open in our thinking at this point to what that relationship needs to look like with our land-grant partners in the region, for example. One of the things that I learned early on in our discussion about this, you heard at lunch the video that John Burge from USDA relayed to the conference. I went and visited with the folks in USDA about this idea last fall. And one of the things immediately that they said to me was, there's an auspices for things like this underneath the Farm Bill, right? And the Farm Bill's up for debate currently, as we know, federally. And there are structures in place to encourage regional efforts like this for universities to work together. And I think you heard John mention that. If you were listening carefully to his comments today, he referenced the fact that this could be a model. I think he used the language that what you might do in the northern Great Plains, I think was the context he used, might be a model that he would hope others would pick up around the country, maybe outside the U.S. So I think this conversation we're having here is all about scoping out what those relationships might be like. We have 10 land-grant universities represented here at the conference. We're tremendously pleased with that. So that we can have that, listening on those conversations tomorrow, I think will be great. Now, 1994 is part of that. The 1890s and 1994s are part of that as well.
We're here.
Denny Barron's Office of Rural Health for the state. It's interesting as I think about the university, and inside the university sits colleges, and one of the traditional definitions of colleges was that they were communities. And so we're having this discussion, which kind of goes back to the very creation, in my mind, of what we have in our state and in other universities. The other issue I think that's sitting out here, at least it's sitting out here for me, is that we now have moved from a very linear way of thinking of things to a very organic way of thinking of things. A simple explanation of that or example is, well, everything's connected to everything else. We use that in our language all the time. So part of the challenge that I think we're wrestling with here, and all the panelists and all the speakers basically have been trying to encourage us, I think, to begin to do this. The other challenge we have in this country right now, and probably in the world, is that we have a tough time with all of the framing that's going on. There are very negative frames that are out there, and we have given negative frames to ourselves in rural America. We're the sickest, we're the oldest, we're the poorest, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So I'm sitting here thinking, and part of it is because it's the world I live in, that maybe what we should be talking about is health. And my definition of health that I want you to ponder, and I'd like you to respond to this, is when everything works. So could we use that as a frame of which the Rural Futures, the Rural Institute would be focused on, and our goal would be to make this community, whatever community you're in, the state we're in, the region we're in, the nation we're in, and the world, the healthiest place it could possibly be? And how do we do that? So if anybody wants to respond to those ideas, I would really welcome that. Thank you.
I wouldn't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you don't mind. And just upstate is a little town called Crete, Nebraska. And one of the things that they've tried to do in the health department there is to deal with maternal child health problems. They have a new changing demographic in Crete. A lot of Hispanic immigrants are working in slaughterhouses there. So they had to figure out how could a health department, and I know this is a little bit off, but I'll try and bring it back to a Rural Futures Institute. How could a health department engage the citizens in this community and in these different communities come together to help make the community prosper better and have healthier babies and all of that? So they did engage in a conversation where the issue was, and I don't know the details, but the issue was framed in a way that the people in the community could engage it. And I'm just wondering if the university then, or a Rural Futures Institute, could help the people in these colleges, in these college communities, learn how to engage with communities differently other than just the more traditional academic approach. Part of the curriculum, perhaps.
I can't let this one go by. I think, Maxine, when you came up this morning and you were holding a copy of the magazine that we just put out from, this is not a commercial, but it's just to reiterate the point that the gentleman just made, that is titled Growing a Healthy Future. That is a magazine we just started in our Institute of Ag and Natural Resources. We spent a year coming up with that title and thinking about it. So I absolutely could not agree more with the frame. It's the way you frame these things. If we frame it negatively, if we think that rural America is declining, guess what? Likely it is. And I don't think that either. I really think we're in this different time where we should be looking at how the future of rural Nebraska, the Great Plains, whatever, is about to experience a renaissance. I really believe that. But it may not look like we think that it might, so I couldn't agree with the gentleman more.
I have to say I agree as well. What a beautiful frame to use. Some of you know of the Community Campus Partnerships for Health, higher education association that has very robust thinking around engaged scholarship and how to have public health professionals to think about their engaged work. I mean, they have everything from toolkits to a peer review portal where you can submit non-traditional scholarly artifacts, very rich. But there are also civic health indicators that we're working with in the American Commonwealth Partnership that are models to go forward with that.
We have one over here.
Yeah, Matt Haybrock with the Nebraska Corn Growers Association. And I guess the question I want to pose is, in rural Nebraska, our communities are very much supported by agriculture. It's the driving force of our economy. So with that, and I've heard Dr. Green speak before on the vision of the university being the premier institute on food, as we look at feeding this growing population and so forth. So my question is kind of twofold in how that vision of this agriculture and food production ties into rural futures, and what role do nonprofits like the Nebraska Corn Growers Associations and Farm Bureaus play into this as well. And we've spent a lot of time today talking about the entrepreneurship of Main Street, rural Nebraska. What role do the the ag companies like the John Deeres and the Pioneers of the world play that are huge employers in rural communities? What role does the institute possibly have in recruiting more of those type of positions into rural America as well?
I think I suspect that at this point in the formation of the Institute, we should applaud you as asking the right questions.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm Daphne Greenwood from the University of Colorado, and I want to first applaud you. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm very impressed with the conference that you put together and a lot of the issues that have been raised and all the energy and positive thought. But I want to return to your question about risks that the Institute will face, because it seems to me there's a big one that people haven't really dealt with. You've talked a lot about people in communities needing to understand their own strengths and organize and be able to articulate what they need, and that's good. And you've talked about lessening barriers in academia, in order to encourage those of us there to work more in communities. But there are times when both of those might be working quite well, but powerful economic interests could collide with what ought to happen. And that might be either with the legislature, who I'm sure is giving you a lot of your mission, and it could also be with the fact that the university is more and more dependent on private money. All universities all across the country are, so I'm sure you are also. And clearly, as a land-grant institution, a lot of that is agribusiness money. So how do you deal with, you just really need to be realistic about the fact that sometimes those powerful interests are not going to necessarily want the same thing that the people in the communities might want, that the experts might have decided are a good idea, and how are you going to maintain your integrity and stay focused when those challenges come up?
I want to take that one on. One of the original kind of reasons that personally I wanted to engage in this discussion, I meant to say this when I framed the opening, and I realized just now from your question I didn't, was that if we are successful as a land-grant university in a state like Nebraska, to go to the gentleman's comment over here a minute ago, we're going to continue to innovate production of products and services, in our case largely food-related, from the natural resource base that we have, in more and more powerful ways, more efficiently, more productively, the use of new technologies, all of that. It's part of our remit, and I sure hope we're successful at it, because we've got big challenges ahead in order to do that. But, as I said last night, we also have an obligation to the people of the state of Nebraska, in our case as a land-grant university, to couple that with what does that mean on the landscape of what the state has as communities and people. So, as I said last night, fewer people needed in agriculture. Technology is going to drive it, continue to drive it larger. I fully expect that to be the case. So, to your point, big agribusiness, as an example, I would hope that the John Deeres, that the Monsantos, that the Syngentas, that the Cargills, and you could fill in lots of names into that category, will be directly engaged with us in this conversation. That they will be directly involved in wanting a bright rural future for the communities in the state and the region. I expect that that will happen, but we've got to find a way to engage with them to do that. I understand the concern, but I'm not worried about it, because I don't think we've engaged them the right way yet in order to make that happen. So part of the impetus here, what I'm telling you, is I think we've got to make that intersection. We've got to help make that happen in new ways that we've not done before. That makes sense. The others might want to add.
Well, I guess I would add as Chancellor of the University, I have no doubt that if this institute does its job correctly, many of the things it does will be very controversial. You don't effectuate change without interfering with established interest, and that's going to be a problem. But I also don't think you have a university unless you exercise the leadership and use the assets that you have to advance going forward. And our experience in Nebraska, at least over the course of the last several years, is if you are transparent about what you're doing and honest about the reasons for it and clear about the rationale for the recommendations, people in Nebraska have been pretty good about understanding, even though they don't agree with us.
I'm gonna add one comment. I'm gonna put JB on the spot a little bit here. President Milliken of the university system. When we first started talking about this, one of the comments that I made to the president and to Linda Pratt in conversations we were having about this, as I said, if we do this, if we go down this path, and if we're serious about it, it's going to take some courage. Because it's going to require risks. It's going to require us to do things that we've not done before. It's going to require us to take on issues that are controversial, that might not have everyone all on the same page. We heard that several times today. How do you get people to take risks? The risk-taking aspect of this. And Harvey's absolutely right. This is going to, if we're going to do this right, it will take some courage to do it.
Tom?
Since we've mentioned risk and courage, one thing that the Institute might think about that will really take courage is to take a look at comprehensive water policy in the state, because as you know, at one time it was assumed that surface water and groundwater were not connected. So now we have DNR, Department of Natural Resources, governing surface water, NRD governing groundwater, and never the two shall meet. And so there's obviously enough hydrological information and enough smart people in the university system to come up with a comprehensive water model. And I think the university would be perceived as somewhat at arm's length enough to avoid some of the political infighting that has happened. And this may be a reach, but this would be a real service to the state, because last year we had a wet year and nobody talked much about water, but we're going to be right back where we were, and we need to have a comprehensive water policy, I think.
This conversation is very interesting and probably getting more interesting, but the time is also when we're supposed to end this session. I'm sorry to the two of you that have stood because we don't have time, but tomorrow is a session devoted to getting more of your comments and to engaging with you about some of these critical questions. And so we hope those comments and others of you will participate actively tomorrow and help us figure out what to do with this institute. I hope you will join me in thanking our panelists